Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Carrie Simpson, and I'm the founder of Managed Sales Pros and also the host of the podcast Hallway Conference. We're a couple of minutes early, so I'm going to give everybody a few minutes to join and get settled, maybe grab a cup of coffee. Got quite a few people on the webinar today that I've never met, so thank you for joining and welcome. We'll go through a little bit of housekeeping. You'll see that there is a Q&A chat panel. You should be able to feed questions to me in real time, which I am happy to answer. If I don't get to the question, or if you have follow-up questions you'd like answered, my contact information will be available at the end of the webinar. Looks like everybody can hear me all right, and that audio and video are running smoothly today, which is nice. We use a platform called Big Marker for webinars, and it's been a really interesting transition from Zoom and some of the other more traditional platforms. It's a little more functional, but it also has a ton of features that I never use. So every time I host a webinar in Big Marker, I try and enable a brand new feature so that I'm not always overwhelmed with things beeping, buzzing, and blinking. And the chat feature today is one that I'm trying out for the first time. So it shows me who's on the webinar. I don't believe it shows you guys who's on the webinar unless you're interacting with each other in the public chat forum. So you are more than welcome to connect with each other. I encourage it, especially if you're all considering starting podcasts. It's always good to bounce ideas off of people. But we're right at the top of the hour, so we'll get started. So today's topic is, should you start a podcast? And maybe a better topic was, should I have started a podcast? I learned a ton trying to do this throughout the pandemic, and it was a phenomenal experience. Now, I learned better myself by just pushing buttons and pulling levers until money falls out the bottom. I don't necessarily recommend that for podcasting, but it was a really fun project for me, especially when there wasn't a lot of places to go or a lot of people to meet up with in person. It was a really nice way to start interacting with a new community. So I don't know about your marketing, but for me, I've been doing a lot of the same things for a lot of years. So we've been in business for I want to say 8 years now. And we've done pretty much the same things for marketing for the entire 8 years we've been in business. At the beginning, we did a lot of trade shows. We, of course, do a lot of cold calling. We're a cold calling company. We did a weekly newsletter, and we've done webinars for ourselves and for other vendors as often as possible. So our goal has always been to be a thought leader in the lead generation space. I think that our marketing initiatives achieved that for us, but I had to evaluate what we were doing this year and decide, did I want to add new things into the mix and what might be no longer necessary for us. So one of the things that I stopped doing this year was publishing our newsletter. I noticed it was the same, same 50 people opening and reading the newsletter. None of those 50 have ever purchased anything from me. So for me, it was kind of an interesting exercise in what hits, what doesn't hit, and what actually turns into revenue. And that for me is the most important reason that you would do anything. So there isn't a lot of point in starting a podcast unless you can figure out a way to monetize it. And I think we did that really well. And I'm excited to share with you what we came up with. So my podcast is called Hallway Conference. And the point of the podcast is I wanted to create some of those interactions that you have in the hallway at an event. So we go to our keynotes and we go to the breakouts and we go to dinner with vendors and we go to these sessions, but most of the time, the value that I get from a conference is just bumping into peers in the hallway and saying, hey, how are you handling this? Hey, there's a staffing shortage right now. What's working for you for recruiting? What could we try? What should we change? And then meeting people from different areas sometimes even different verticals. So if I go to a Zoho conference, for example, that's not like going to a managed services conference where I'm a vendor. At a Zoho conference, I buy the product and I want to interact with other people that are using the product. So I wanted to create some of those kind of organic bump into each other and chat conversations. So that was the whole point around the theme of our podcast. But of course, we always want to talk about sales and marketing. We want to share some tips with the people that are viewing the podcast. We want them to get value out of it. And ultimately, we want it to be a catalyst for them to interact with us. And that's the hard part with podcasting. It's not easy to measure. It's not like you send out a newsletter, 50 people open it, you call those 50 people and 30 people buy from you, or whatever your numbers look like. Podcasts are hard to measure, especially at the beginning. So our agenda for today's webinar: the things that you need to consider before you start your podcast, the moving parts that you need to assemble and manage to have an effective podcast, the vendors and software that we tried working with and which ones we ultimately chose and why, how you coordinate guests and invite guests to your podcast, how you promote your podcast, and ultimately, how do you measure whether or not this is a marketing initiative that is successful. So marketing is one of those nebulous things, right? I know that half of my marketing is working. I just don't know which half. Well, it shouldn't be like that. You should be able to put numbers and metrics on any marketing initiative, and podcasting is no different. You get to decide what's important to you in your marketing spend. So if brand recognition is important to you, podcasting will be an essential part of becoming a thought leader in your industry or community. So here are the things that you need to think about before you launch your podcast. Like, one, what software will you need to do this effectively? Well, you're going to need something to record the podcast. There's lots of different ways to do this. You can record directly to your laptop. You can record directly to the cloud using your laptop. You can record on your phone. You can record on your phone directly to the cloud. And there are probably 100 different platforms. We evaluated about 10 of them. You're going to need something to edit your podcast. So you're usually not going to publish 120 minutes of you talking or of you and a guest talking. There are going to be mistakes. There's going to be bloopers. There's going to be dead time. There's going to be ums and ahs. And there's going to be your cat walking in or your kids running around. You're going to want to eliminate a lot of noise from that. So you're going to need some software to edit those things out. Some of those come pre-built into the recording platforms, but they aren't effective the way that a purpose-built editing software will be. You're going to need to publish your podcast. So after you get all of the bells and whistles all joined together and you like the product, you're going to have to host it somewhere. And that's how you get your podcast distributed on Apple and Spotify and Google and all the other places where people download things to listen to them. So you'll choose which one of those you're going to use. And fortunately, if you don't like one, you can usually transfer all or some of your podcasts to another platform. So that's one of the least important pieces because it's one of the easiest ones to change. And it's also one of the least expensive pieces of the puzzle. You're going to need some design software. So you're going to need cover art, audiograms, social media posts, banners. There's all kinds of moving pieces here. We've found that one of the easiest ways to do that is just to use a platform like Canva, where you can create your cover art, and then each episode might have cover art involved with it as well. And you can use the same images over and over again. You swap out a picture of one person, you add in the picture of the next person, change the name, change the title. That's a pretty easy part. And then you're going to need the software that you're going to use to promote your podcast. So you're likely already promoting your business in a bunch of different channels already. You don't have to reinvent the wheel here. You're just going to start talking about your podcast more often. You'll need to think about the things that you need or the hardware that you're going to need to podcast. One really important thing is make sure you got a ton of memory available on either your PC or your phone, wherever you decide you're going to record your podcast, because some of the systems won't record directly to the cloud. They'll record to your computer, and then that's going to upload to the cloud. So if you don't have enough space, and we learned this the hard way, it'll cut you off in the middle of your podcast and just bump you right out of the platform. So that happened to me with Justin from App River. more than one time on more than one platform while we were testing this. And it's kind of embarrassing, and it's really inconvenient. And certainly for the guest, it makes you look unprofessional and unpolished. So fortunately, Justin's a buddy of mine. It wasn't too terrible for me, but that would be the first consideration. Do you have a system that is built for recording large amounts of content? And then do you have a system that's going to be amenable to editing that content? So you can't run editing software on a tiny little Chromebook. You're going to need a more powerful machine. And I'm not going to go too much into that. If you work in tech, you're on the podcast today, you likely understand these things far better than I do. But I wish I'd done more research into the things that I would need to support the podcast development before I just launched right into it and started inviting guests. So, perspective before planning. I didn't think about any of these things. I was like, I'm going to start a podcast. It's going to be great. I can't wait. It's going to be fun. I started inviting people and everything else I did afterwards. So maybe don't do it in that order. Maybe think about all of the things that you need to assemble and how you're going to get from, an invited guest to a fully baked podcast. And you'll want to have a bunch of them in the hopper before you begin publishing your podcast, so that you don't have a blank space when you direct people to go and listen to your podcast. Microphone, we tested a ton of them, and I will tell you the results of that later. But frankly, I've liked using this like Amazon all-in-one C connection. I don't even know what they're called, but I mean, it's $20 and it worked better than any of the custom built podcasting microphones that I purchased and tested. The sound is better. It's easier to use. It's certainly not as bulky to pack. I like to sometimes do podcasts while I'm traveling, and dragging around microphones was an enormous pain in my butt. So easy, simple, and you can always upgrade to new things once you get into a routine. The space that you record in, that seems to be the biggest sticking point for most people. So you can have the best podcasting equipment in the world and the speediest machine in the world. If you are in a space where the acoustics are terrible and everything bounces off of everything, you're going to sound tinny no matter what. So if you go listen to different episodes of our podcasts, you can tell that some of them were recorded in an environment that was better for podcasting than others. And you can also hear the difference in some of the different products that we used. So I'll leave it to you to decide which ones that you liked best. But for my purposes, the cheap, easy, simple thing I already had outperformed any of the things that I had to go and order and buy and then figure out how to set up, which was another challenge. Fortunately for you guys being in IT, you have access to experience that I do not. So you're better equipped already to start doing things like this. And then lighting, right? Natural light, I think, looks best. And if you're going to do a video and audio podcast, you'll want to make sure that you're lit well. If you don't have lots of natural light and you don't have a nice built-in camera, obviously you're going to want to order something that's a little more robust than your average, Logitech. And you'll want to make sure that you've got enough light behind you that you are illuminated while your background is fading. And then, of course, you've all been on Zoom meetings for the last 2 years, so everyone knows how to blur their backgrounds or put their company logo in the back. Whatever your personal preference is, those are the things that you'll want to consider while you're recording the podcast. Some people aren't even going to present the video version of their podcast. But for me, I like to take this content and I like to use it over and over again in different areas. So if you're going to record a podcast and you've got the video available to you as well, you can then take that video, you can carve it up into little pieces and use it in other areas of your marketing, which is a great way to do something once and use it over and over and over again. And then the Butterball hotline. Oh, God. Thank you for that. Now I'm derailed. And then there's the people component to podcasting, right? Are you going to host it, or will you have somebody on your team host it? It should be consistent. So you want to have the same person on the podcast every week, but you could also have a guest host. There's a podcast called the MSP Business School, which is run by Osprey Strategic Research. They have two primary hosts for their podcast, Rob and Tim. And then they have a third person that comes on and co-hosts with them. And that person alternates. So you get a little bit of variety. You get different kind of synergy between the hosts and the guests. And then they'll have another guest that isn't a recurring guest on the podcast. So they've got a lot of moving parts. And that's great because sometimes it's really hard to get a podcast out the door every week. You got a lot of stuff on your plate already. Most of the time when we're recording podcasts, we're recording them en masse. So we're going to sit down, we're going to record 2 or 3 of them in a row. We'll send them off to editing and production, and then we'll take a little time off, come back, do it again. You're going to think about who is going to do all the editing, designing, administrative work. Like the lion's share of the work that I had to do putting together my podcast was figuring out like the menial, boring stuff, like trying to collect people's headshots and bios and figuring out how I wanted to lay those out, and then transcribing the podcast and then cutting and pasting that into the production site. There's lots of little tiny, niggly, annoying things that have to get done. And if you're not a detail-oriented person, it's really easy to push all that off. And then before you know it, you've got 8 podcasts that are sitting in a file somewhere, and you haven't had the time to coordinate all of the other pieces. So that's why I say you want to be 4 or 5 podcasts ahead all the time, so you're not constantly scrambling, looking for the assets that you need to publish this week's podcast. And then if you don't have a decent photographer, you'll want a nice photographer for your cover art. You can create all kinds of different looks and feels for your podcast. And if you want to change your episode cover art every week, you'll want somebody that has the skill to do that. We just use the exact same picture that we take someone's face out, we put someone else's face in. And when we create the audiogram, we do the same thing. So we did a lot of work creating templates at the beginning, and we just use them over and over again. So we've kind of got it down to the point now where we can record the podcast and we can have that podcast ready to go in under a week. And that includes having to send it out for editing, reviewing it, adjusting it, and then getting it taken live. So why are you going to start a podcast to begin with? Well, the most important part of sales right now for managed service providers is becoming thought leaders. And that's because everybody already has IT support. Everybody knows what IT support is, and nobody cares. Right? Nobody understands the difference between your services and the services they're buying already. And the best explanation I have for this is if you are selling photocopiers for Xerox, the odds on you being successful are significantly higher than if you work for Joe's Photocopiers. Everybody knows who Xerox is. So the more brand recognition you have when you call into a company to ask somebody to take a meeting with you, the more likely you'll get the meeting if somebody has already heard of you. So the more places and spaces that you can get your name and face out there, the better. So while you're thinking like, oh, who's going to watch my podcast? There's lots of ways to get people engaged to watch your podcast, including inviting people to participate in that and taking advantage of their network. So the more people that you can reach, the more often, the more likely it is that when your cold caller is looking for new opportunities to schedule meetings so that you can add monthly recurring revenue, the gatekeeper is like, oh, I've heard of your company. Sure, Joe's in, let me find him. And so thought leadership isn't so much about writing articles about cold calling. Like every week for 8 years, I have written an article about cold calling. And they're really along the themes of cold call more often, get better at cold calling, cold call more often, get better at cold calling. And you think that you couldn't write an article like that every week for 7 years, but we have. And we've done webinars that are similar. And the more times you're creating content, the more times you can reuse that content. So if you think about sitting down and creating the agenda for your podcast, perhaps you write a blog post first, and then you figure out who in your network could speak intelligently about the thing that you've just written about. And you start calling people to invite them to participate in your podcast. It's a far easier call than, hey, would you like to buy managed IT services from us? Hey, we're hosting a podcast on X. We record every Tuesday. We'd love to have you speak to this, or this. Which of those topics is most interesting to you? And then collaborate with them and get them on your podcast. Then get access to their entire network when they distribute the podcast for you. So once you get those relationships built and become known as, a podcaster or somebody who hosts a podcast that people are interested in listening to, your reach just extends well beyond your own personal network. And that's what marketing is all about. Your podcast can be simple, right? You don't have to try 10 different products. You can just pick one. Pick the simplest one, pick the one that's easiest for you to use, and don't worry about making it perfect. Your podcast is never going to be perfect. You can improve as you go. And there are blog posts, for example, that I wrote in 2015 where I read them and I cringe a little bit, like, oh God, what was I thinking? But not many people are scrolling back in my blog to 2015 to go see whether I contradicted myself in a post that I've made in 2020, for example. So don't worry about trying to make everything perfect. Worry about starting and worry about the small pieces that all have to fit together in order for you to get your podcast published. And the nice thing is you don't have to rely on anyone else to do that. You can figure it out all on your own, especially if you're tech savvy. Podcasting is going to help you prospect, and I'm going to walk you through that at the end of the kind of review of the things that we tried that we didn't like and the things that we chose and why. But inviting people to your podcast is a great way to prospect for new business. Having people suggest who might like to be on your podcast, and then you have the opportunity to call them with a warm introduction. Podcasting is a great way to just expand your network. And the more people that are in your network, the more likely it is you're going to get referrals back from your network. So think about podcasting less as how am I going to provide extraordinary value to my listener base, and more about who can I invite to participate in this with me that can provide some extraordinary value to my user base. You don't want to talk about IT every week for the next 120 weeks. There are business challenges out there that need to be solved universally, whether you are supporting law firms or accounting firms, engineers, government. Companies have issues, and you don't always have to talk about the thing that you're an expert in, right? What are you struggling with in your business right now? What would you like to learn? Start finding the people that you don't want to pay for consulting and invite them to come on your podcast and talk about a problem that you're having. Talk about a free and easy way to get some phenomenal ideas from people that may or may not run in your circle on a regular basis. Podcasting helps you add organic SEO. So if you go take a look at our podcast, which is hosted on Buzzsprout, you can see that for every podcast, we write a synopsis of the podcast episode, and it always mentions my name, and it always mentions Managed Sales Pros, and it always mentions some of the keywords that I'm trying to outrank my competitors on. And then it's going to link back to my website. So not only do I get backlinks between my website, which has decent domain authority for a small business, but I get a link back from Buzzsprout, which has significantly higher domain authority. So one of the ways that Google decides whether or not it's going to allow you one of their premier spots is by how important or how much of an expert it believes you are based on the amount of content that you're publishing and the other sites that you link to. So when you're creating content, you don't just want to link to the things that you do and the properties that you have access to. You want to convince other people to link to it. So that goes back to inviting guests that have a little more authority in the market than you do. If you can get a vendor to come participate in your podcast, well, Cisco's domain authority is much higher than yours. And if you can get Cisco to promote your podcast on their website and link back to your podcast and your website, now you've got a little bit more weight behind you, and Google will look at that and say, oh, these guys know what they're talking about because Cisco believes that they know what they're talking about. There's all kinds of complex algorithms. I don't even pretend to understand any of them, but we do read a lot about this and we try things and it works. So as much as I thought SEO was kind of like smoke and mirrors and fairy dust a couple of years back, through the pandemic, I got certified in a couple of HubSpot courses. One of the ones that I enjoyed the most and I thought was the most interesting was how you figure out what terms you want to rank for in SEO. So if I want to rank for cold calling managed services, well, that search term gets used regularly, like thousands of times a month. So people are fighting to be the first person on Google using that search term, which means I'm either going to have to spend a ton of money to outrank them or be really creative in the way that I'm going to use that term over and over again on my website, because Google will penalize me if my content is nonsense. And it will also penalize me if I don't use it often enough. So trying to rank for the biggest, most popular terms in your market is always going to be challenging. So best IT support Michigan, it's going to be really challenging for us to outrank the people that are paying to rank for that search term. But if you go and learn how to compare what your competitors are ranking for and figure out which ones people are searching for more often than others, but not so often that it's going to be extremely competitive to rank for it, you can start slowly but surely using the terminology or the key search terms that are going to help you raise to the top. And you can do that on your podcast in addition to doing it on your website. So if you've got those mentions on your podcast over and over again, it's linking to your website and those search terms are mentioned there. The more often your company name and your name comes up when people are searching for things, the more likely it is that they're going to visit your website. So truly, they may never listen to your podcast at all, but if the transcript mentions you and everything you do and those search terms over and over again, now you've really got the opportunity to start bumping up in search terms without spending a ton of money on SEO. So yeah, you'll spend some time on podcasting and you'll spend a little bit of money on podcasting, but the organic reach that you get from a well-done podcast that is SEO optimized, the organic reach you'll get is significantly better than the spend that you'd have to make to get the same amount of activity. The podcast that you're creating will also allow you to take that content, chop it into little bits, use it in newsletters, use it in social, use it on your website, use it everywhere. So make it once and then use it 100 times. I've got these little 2-minute videos. What I normally do is set up in a corner and I set up using the podcasting equipment. Now, light it well, sit there. I have a list of questions that people have either submitted over time or that they asked me at the last trade show that I went to. And then I just talk into the camera for like 2 hours straight. I take all of that content. I have one camera that shoots me straight on. I have one camera that shoots from the side. I take both of those recordings and I send them off to an editor and they create little 2-minute clips from that. So I'm not constantly having to memorize, a perfect 2-minute delivery on why cold calling is important for managed services providers. I can just talk and the editor that I work with understands our industry and understands me well enough to know that she can take this piece out. She's going to add that piece, but I'm always wearing the same thing. I'm always sitting in the exact same spot and the camera angles are always exactly the same. So she can take that 2 hours of content and turn it into dozens of little 2-minute clips that then go into newsletters, that then go onto my YouTube channel, that then promote my podcast. So the more you can do after recording one thing one time, the more successful your marketing initiatives will be and the less expensive they're going to be. I put that one in for my 10-year-old who says it all the time. So next. So in any marketing initiative, you don't really want to go all in all at once, right? You start with where you are and don't overcomplicate it. So phase 1 of any marketing activity is always going to be consistent, right? We want to get you from never making a podcast to creating a podcast every, whatever cadence is good for you. I do one every week. Maybe you want to do one every month to begin with. You want to create a schedule that you're going to publish on and you're going to commit to publishing on that schedule. Doesn't matter if it's the worst podcast in the world and your artwork isn't perfect and the sound isn't perfect. Being consistent is more important than being perfect. So done is always better than perfect. And for those of you who are overachieving entrepreneurs like myself, I can find plenty of ways to obfuscate trying to perfect things when I should actually be working. So your goal is to create the content and get the content out there. You're not going to be able to polish it 18 times because it will never have any ROI if you have to touch it all the time. So I'm the highest paid asset at my business. If I spend 20 hours on a podcast, that podcast is useless. I don't have any margin on anything I sell based on that podcast because I spent 20 hours that I could have been billing out at $1,000 an hour on creating this podcast that, maybe 100 people are going to listen to. And yes, it might translate into business, but I've already killed the margin from that business because I spent 20 hours creating that one piece of content. Use entry-level solutions to begin. So you might try it and hate it, right? So if you're going to pick up a sport, for example, let's say you've decided that this is the year you're going to pick up golf. you're not going to go buy the best clubs in the world and join the most elite club you can find. You're probably going to go play a public course with some rental clubs. So think about podcasting that way. You want to find out if you even like it. You want to find out if you've got the time to commit to it. You want to find out whether or not it's something that you're going to be able to commit to on a regular basis. So until you get to the point where you absolutely know that this is a thing you want to keep doing, that it's actually generating some interest for you, don't go all in and buy the most expensive things that you can find. Just get entry-level solutions and start playing with things, right? Create habits around it and create standard operating procedures so that if it turns out that you win the lottery and you decide you're not coming back to work ever again, somebody else can step into your podcasting spot and replicate what it is that's been working. So one of the things that I didn't do well at the beginning, and maybe still am not doing that well, is creating an agenda for the podcast that's very consistent. So something that I could give to the people that I was hosting that identified, hey, here's what we're going to talk about. Here's how we structure it. Here are the 3 questions I always ask if you'd like to prepare for them. And then I want a 20-minute fireside chat about how you maximize the time that you spend at conferences. So if it's a vendor, I want to hear how they choose what conferences they go to. And I want to learn how they interact with prospects, how they follow up with prospects afterwards, what their conversion rates look like, how much they normally spend. So I always ask some of the very same questions, no matter who's on the podcast. If it's a managed service provider coming on the podcast, I'm going to ask them what they look for in an event. So what events do they go to? Why do they go to them? What do they do when they get there? Are they the type of person that goes to every breakout session and every keynote? Or do they just skip all of it, go to the pool, smoke cigars, and get drunk? Right? I really want to have conversations that tell the people that are watching the podcast how they could improve the conference experience, not just for the people that are paying to sponsor it, but for the people that are paying to attend. So those things I try to keep very consistent. But at the beginning, it was more like just a free-for-all chat. And sometimes it lasted 40 minutes and sometimes it lasted an hour and 20 minutes if we were having a good time. But that's not a good way to build a following. If I go listen to a podcast and I've budgeted 30 minutes for it, and maybe I'm listening to a 60-minute podcast that I turn on to 2 times speed so that I can get through it in 30 minutes. And it turns out that this podcast is like an hour and a half long. Kind of think like, oh, all right, well, I was prepared to give this an hour, but I don't know if I'm prepared to give it 90 minutes. And you can lose a lot of your your listeners, when you're inconsistent with the length of time that you commit to the podcast. So there's nothing saying you can't do 2 5-minute quick podcasts a week and then 1 60-minute deep dive. You get to choose the structure for your podcast, but whatever it is, try to be consistent with it. And create your content first. So before you go out and do your cover art and your intro and your outro and all the other things you have to do, make sure you've got a handful of podcasts already recorded that you can then play around with to see what it's going to look like and sound like at the end of that project. So instead of creating all this stuff and then deciding like, oh, I really hate this. I spent all this money on this custom, like we have an intro and outro that we had a professional voice actor do, for example. If I decided to abandon podcasting 2 podcasts in, well, I spent a lot of money on creating this podcast that's now kind of junk for me. So first record a ton of podcasts, like 5 podcasts. That's 5 hours of content, probably take you 10 hours to do once you get everything downloaded. Get through the first 5, listen to them, figure out what you like, figure out what you don't like. Maybe you want to ditch 1 or 2 of them because you didn't like how it sounded. Once you've got those 5 podcasts created, then we're going to send them out to editing. They're going to come back and then start thinking about, okay, what do the bumpers sound like? Is there going to be an ad for our business in the middle of it? Like, how do we want to create and structure the podcast? Once you have your content, the rest of it is easy. So that big hurdle is always, I need 5 people to interview for this podcast, because nobody wants to listen to me talk for an hour about cold calling every week. Right? They want the interaction with the other person. And I want to talk about other things. Cold calling podcast is great. But if that's not a problem that you're experiencing with your business right now, how can I attract other listeners who may not have been considering cold calling, but who might now that they're regularly listening to something that I'm producing? So phase 2 of your podcasting experiment is going to be creating a professional podcast. So now you're consistent. You've got time earmarked for it. You've got an SOP, so you do it the same way every time. Now's when you invest in better space for recording. And better space might just be one of those little folding tents that you can put around the boom mic so that the sound isn't bouncing off the walls and sounding tinny all the time. You may want to upgrade your software at this point. Maybe you want to go to a better platform that allows you to distribute to more places, right? The one that I work with now, I think I can publish on 10 or 12 different platforms. So you may not want to publish on all of them, but if it's all included already, why not? You can invest in better equipment. So now that you know that you like it and you're going to do it consistently, maybe now you want to upgrade to better microphones, for example. Again, those microphones are a pain to drag around with you. So if you're going to be in one spot podcasting all the time, go for it. Get the best boom mic setup you can. But if you've got to travel, you're going to want to evaluate different ways of recording while you're on the road. You're not going to have that nice little space. You're not going to have that enormous microphone with all the things that are around it to dampen out the sound. So think about where you're going to be podcasting and then make an investment based on where you're most likely to be when you're recording. Right? It's hard to record podcasts in hotel rooms, but we're still doing it all the time. And then find great creative and a great editor, right? If you're not already an audio editor, I can't say this enough times, you're going to need someone to work with you to either teach you how to do it and what to listen for so that you know when things are going off the rails and you know why you need to carve that 5-minute piece out and how do you make it sound smooth instead of just like talking again, right? You want to be able to smoothly transition. And the only people that I found that were able to do that well were people who were professionally trained to do it. Fortunately, you can find those people all over the place. You can find very inexpensive offshore ones on Fiverr, and we're going to go through our experiment with that as well. We work with somebody who lives in the UK. They edit all of our audio and video. And that was a great investment for us. I'm happy that we did it. We were able to identify talent at around the $55,000 a year mark. And for us, that was price point wise comfortable. If it's not for you, then you'll want to look at some lower cost options, but you still want to try a bunch of different people until you find the one that clicks with you the best. Phase 3 of podcasting is going to be predictable. Predictable. Let's just pretend I spelled that right, but predictable. You want people to anticipate and expect your podcast that comes out on Thursday, right? Thursday at 2:00, your new podcast drops. Best case scenario, you've got a group of people that are excited about that happening. And the way to get to that point is to invite guests with more reach and to use your podcast content in different marketing materials. So you want to promote your podcast. You want to get people to the point where they are excited about it. You want to promote whatever guest you're going to have next Thursday or the Thursday after. And this is another touch point for you for your marketing. So if you're already sending out a newsletter, great. The podcast newsletter can be something that you send out that isn't salesy at all. You're not trying to sell them anything. You're not trying to convince them to upsell. You just want them to come and learn about this business problem that they're probably having. You can measure your results with podcasting and improve them. So don't let anyone tell you that it can't be measured. It can absolutely be measured. You have to decide what KPIs are important to you and then manage them week over week. And if they're not there, you have to learn how to fix that. So that's probably the biggest challenge when it comes to podcasting. Creating the podcast, well, you can pay someone to do that. Measuring the results, you can also pay someone to do that. But if you're a DIY podcaster and you're a DIY podcaster because of budget, you're not going to be able to afford the marketing agency that is going to do the complex metrics that are going to be required to tell you like, hey, yeah, your subscription rate went up by this, but they're only listening to 10% of it. Or, there's lots of ways that marketing companies measure engagement. What I look for when I'm measuring whether or not my podcast is doing what I want it to do for me is I look at the number of people that have clicked onto the page. And then I look at the number of people who listen to the podcast versus the number of people that download the podcast. And then I look to see where those people are coming from. So, for example, if all of my listeners are in Germany, this podcast is useless to me because I don't sell anything in Germany. I need North American managed service providers. I can also track their IP addresses. So I can see kind of who is listening to the podcast. Then I can go and compare those records to the IP addresses of the people that are visiting our website. So I can start kind of narrowing down who the people are that are actually downloading our podcast. And that takes a little more time, but for me, it's an important way to identify whether or not I'm getting what I want from my podcast. And remembering that you need to publish on a timeline, because if you normally publish every Thursday and then you go 3 Thursdays without doing it, people just assumed you abandoned your podcast and they go listen to something else. So let's start with the tools that we evaluated, and remember that no, by no means are we podcasting experts. We're just a company that wanted to use podcasting in marketing, and we had a lot of fun figuring out how to do it. So the first thing we did was like, somebody else can handle this problem for us, right? We built our entire business on outsourcing. People pay us because they don't want to deal with their cold calling. I didn't want to deal with podcasting. I wanted to hire a company to do it for me. I wanted to show up, record my podcast, and be done with it. Turns out that nothing is ever that simple. We tested 3 different outsourced providers over the last 6 months. The prices for 4 podcasts per month, plus a spare in case there was one that was just garbage and we couldn't use it. So call it 5 podcasts a month, ranged anywhere from $500 a month to $3,000 a month. And they had different bells and whistles and different things tied in, but ultimately our results were similar regardless of price. So it didn't matter if we were paying $500 for our 4 podcasts or $3,000 for our podcasts, the results were similar. The turnarounds weren't what they committed to. So people would say, yeah, we can turn your podcast around in 3 days. Well, that timeline is closer to 13 more often than it wasn't. And that was consistent through every company that we tried to work with. Our SLAs were never met. There was a huge lack of English language comprehension, which was a challenge. If somebody is transcribing your podcast for you, you need them to speak English. So the first podcast, and I left them. So if you want to go check out Hallway Conference, you can see the way that the podcast develops over time. So the first one, the first transcript is just crap. Like there's there's really no comprehension in those show notes at all. So I had to edit some of the show notes at the beginning because they were just like completely missed the mark. So there will be people who could work with a third-party agency like that because they're going to have more time, more patience, and they're going to want to save money more than they're going to want to move quickly or more than they're going to want to have a high-quality product. So maybe you don't want show notes at all. Maybe you're just going to record the podcast and you don't care about that. But if you're using an SEO optimization strategy, you need those show notes in there. You need that transcript in there. And I want to take that transcript, I want to pull the best parts out of it, and I want to turn it into a blog post in the future. So I want someone else doing that for me. But if I have to go and read the show notes, that means I'm reading an hour's worth of transcript in addition to the hour that I had to spend recording and the hour that I had to spend listening to it after the editing was done. Every time I touch it, podcasting becomes less profitable for me. So the promised land is to find somebody that can do all these things for you that are reliable and produce a high quality product. And the companies that we tried did none of these things. The editing was poor. It sounded like they just ran it through the same editing suite that we have access to through our Buzzsprout subscription, for example. So there are podcasting software programs where when you're finished recording, it'll upload it and then you just click a button, it equalizes things and it gets rid of humming and it gets rid of background noise. And that's what the podcast sounded like. It didn't sound like they'd been professionally edited, and they didn't have enough English comprehension to understand when I said, hey, I need you to cut out the part where I said something shitty about ConnectWise. Right? Like that was a problem. Somebody like you said something bad about a vendor. That's not something I want on my podcast. I need someone to edit that out. Either I have to go back and listen to the entire podcast to identify where we said that thing and then give them the exact timestamp so they can carve it out. Or I could partner with someone who has better English comprehension skills where I can say, hey, anytime we say a company name, I need that blurred, right? We don't want to talk about other companies on our podcast. We don't want negative blowback from a guest saying something about a vendor. And I mean, we've said some things about vendors as well where yeah, no, I know. See, I don't give me the bait. Don't tee that up for me. specifically when we're talking about trade shows, like we talk about IT Nation a lot, like to the point where I think when Rob and Tim were on the podcast, we had to get to the point where we were going to take a shot. The next person that said IT Nation had to buy drinks for the rest of IT Nation next year. So there are times where you just need somebody who speaks English well enough to go in and look for the things that are flawed. So bad editing, bad transcripts, unintelligible show notes. So not just bad show notes, but show notes that made no sense at all. Poor creative, right? Like creative is important. And if that's included in the package that you're buying, you'd like it to look professional, and ours did not. So that was something that we had to go back in and redo ourselves. And again, if I have to do it again myself, why would I pay for that service? They were consistently understaffed. And I know that we're all understaffed right now, but they weren't able to meet our publication deadlines, the ones that they had suggested and given to us at onboard. And they never communicated with us when they missed those deadlines, which is really important to me. So you decide what's important to you, but all of these things were important to me for my podcast. And they just threw a lot of work back on our plate. So it's not a set it and forget it service, which is really what I wanted out of a podcasting service. I wanted somebody who would take care of everything for me. And the first company that we worked with actually came the closest, and they were also the most expensive. They came the closest to the vision that I had in mind for what I wanted. They came up with the name of the podcast, the theme of the podcast. They focused on how we were going to drive traffic to it. And they even had a service where they would invite guests for you, except that their turnover was so high that every time we got to the point where we were ready to start doing PR for the podcast, we had to start over with a new person. So we got to the point where we were 2 months in, we didn't even have one podcast published yet. And we had they're supposed to be able to turn around a podcast in a week, and they were unable to get us any podcasts in the 2 months that we were working with them. So that was a challenge, and not one that I was okay with. So we did our research, we found another one, we tried it again. That one didn't work either. So 3 companies in, we were just like, F it, we're going to do it ourselves. So the recording studio software that we tried Riverside, and that's riverside.fm, and Riverside crashed constantly. And that may have been because we didn't understand how much space we needed in order to record. But the challenge with that is, unless you're going to tell your guests what kind of technical specs their systems need, Riverside isn't a great solution unless you're both sitting in the same place, podcasting in the same room. So if you're both mic'd up and hooked up to something and talking in the same place, Riverside's fine. But if you cannot control the quality of the person who's recording on the other side of the world during your podcast, Riverside just wasn't a great option for us. It would shut us out of the system the minute either the guest or the host ran out of memory on their computer. That happened multiple times. And finally, we were just like, no, we can't use this one. So we went on to the next one. Squadcast, I really liked. It was simple and it was easy. And if I was recording 10-minute podcasts where I wasn't making any mistakes and didn't require any editing, we probably would have stayed with Squadcast. Although it was very expensive compared to the other solutions on the market, it was the closest thing we found to a plug-and-play solution. The challenge with it is there is no way to mark when you've screwed up and you need someone to go in and edit. So the other programs that we tried, if there was an issue, say somebody dropped something on the floor and a glass shattered and we know that we need to edit out that sound, there's a hotkey where you can just click a button and then click a button again, and it's going to tell the person editing the podcast to go and listen to that area. So what I had to do when I used Squadcast was try and interview podcast guests. And at the same time, I'd be writing down like, okay, 17 minutes and 11 seconds. I said the F word and I need that edited out. And then, okay, 18:15. We talked about IT Nation yet again. We need to edit that out. So it's really hard to be present for your guest while you're trying to figure out time and date stamping for your editor after the fact. So one way to get around that would be to have a third person on the podcast that does nothing but listen to the podcast and timestamp things. And, if I could afford to hire a person to do nothing but listen to my podcast while I recorded them, I probably would have done that. But if we're going to do this on the quick and dirty and cheap, well, we're not going to have extra assets sitting around who can sit on our podcasts and then, just timestamp where they think I sounded bad. So that wasn't an option for us. We couldn't explore it. But if it's an option for you, I'd highly recommend checking out Squadcast and bringing a third party in to manage the whole process from start to finish. Big Marker is a platform we're using now. We thought we might be able to just record the video and then pull the audio from it. That didn't work. Tried the same thing with Zoom. We didn't like the sound quality on it. And then we tried it with Teams because, hey, Teams is free. Why not use the free product that we already have? Works okay, but not great, right? We liked it, but we didn't like the audio quality, and it wasn't easy to separate files. So one of the things that the purpose-built podcasting software does is take the audio tracks from the host and the guest, and you can have up to, I believe, 10 guests on Squadcast. I can't remember what the count was for Riverside, but you could have 10 people on there. It's going to cut all of the audio tracks out, and then somebody can separately somebody can edit each track. So remove the noise and background noise and F-bombs and ums and ahs and stalls out of each individual track. And then they blend them back together and then they do something else to them. I don't know what it is, but it creates a very nice podcast at the end. So if you're going to have multiple guests, you're definitely going to want to lean towards a more professional product. The one we finally settled on was Zencastr. And we liked it because it did all of the things that I just talked about. It allows me to just hit a button when I'm going off on a tangent and I know I'm going to have to edit out 4 minutes of content. It was also very inexpensive compared to Squadcast. So Squadcast was maybe $140 per month and Zencastr is $20, right? So just as good a product, significantly less expensive. And then Riverside, I believe, was around the $90 to $100 price point as well. Big Marker we were already paying for, so it made sense for us to try it. Zoom, we had a ton of free subscriptions kicking around. We tried that one. And then Teams, of course, came with our Office 365 subscription. So distribution software. We tested Buzzsprout, and we didn't evaluate any others because Buzzsprout did everything we needed to do, and it cost $14 a month. It's cheap. It's simple. It's intuitive. It never glitched on us. And it's very, very easy to use step by step. So even if you've never done a podcast before, not only does Buzzsprout provide a lot of content for people who've never made a podcast before, they really help segment that content into easy to find segments. So if I want to figure out how to do something for a podcast, Buzzsprout's an excellent resource. And it's got like this quick start study guide that'll help you create your podcast just using the PDF that you can download for free before you even sign up. It also gave us a free month. So, that was attractive to us. We weren't sure if we were all in or not at that time. So Buzzsprout was the only thing we tried. So it's the best thing we tried. Podcasting microphones. So the one that was best reviewed, we purchased, and that was the Yeti Blue. We put it on a boom over top of the computer space that we were using, and it had the thing that diffuses sound. Frankly, it didn't sound that great. And I understand now that that probably wasn't the microphone. It's likely the space that we were recording in because we didn't have anywhere for the sound to go. It just bounced off of everything, and it always sounded tinny. The JLab microphone, which I went to Best Buy, so it's a consumer grade product. I liked it. It was easy to set up. I didn't like that it wouldn't just run off a USB. So it had to be plugged in, and it had to be plugged into the computer. And then for audio, you had to plug yet another thing into it. So if you wanted to podcast on the road, you'd have to bring a ton of crap with you in order to use that JLab microphone. So that wasn't a big win for me. We tried the Movi lavalier mic, which comes in a set. So on Amazon.com, you can just go and buy a podcasting quick start kit. And this is great if you're going to use your phone for podcasting. So you put it into the phone, you clip it to your lapel, and you've got a couple of different features. If it's windy out, you use a little cover for it. You can also get splitters so that you can sit with another person and record your podcast on the same platform, which is nice. So it was a quick and easy way to podcast on the go. But if you're going to always record on your phone, your podcast probably isn't going to be as good a quality as it would be if you were going to record sitting in front of a desktop in an appropriate environment. So because we're not recording on our phone, that was something that just kind of got tossed to the wayside. We tried it a few times. We didn't like it as much. So the thing that I like the most is this little Amazon iPhone headset knockoff thing. It's got a built-in mic. It's got headphones. I throw it in my pocket. It's super easy. And if I lose it, I just buy another one and they overnight it to me. And then we tried the same headsets that we use for our call center. It was fine. It was kind of, I don't really like wearing the over-the-ear headsets, but I mean, if it's all you have, absolutely use it. Before you make an investment in anything else, just try the things that you've got on hand. So for me, if we weren't experimenting, I probably would have stayed with this one. It's simple and easy and light. So if you're not going to use a third-party company to do your podcasting, you're probably going to have to assemble a team of contractors, or you're going to have to hire somebody that does this professionally. One is significantly more expensive, and ultimately that's where we shook out to. We hired a person to do this because after trying to collaborate with dozens of people in different time zones, doing different things, it was very challenging. Like what I normally do when I use Fiverr is I take a project and I roll it out to 10 different people, the exact same project. And most of the time they'll price very competitively to win the deal. It's very inconsistent. So some Fiverr contractors are wildly competent and a joy to work with. And one of those examples is the person that did our voiceover and script for the intro and the outro for the podcast. Really smart, asked us great questions, knew way more than we did, understood what we needed and what we wanted. Quick, easy transaction. And then there were like 8 other people who just botched it completely. And some of that is my own communication, right? If you can't clearly outline what you need, what you get back is going to be a hodgepodge of nonsense. So part of the challenge is, as a non-professional marketer or podcaster, trying to figure out how to explain to someone what you want your intro and outro to sound like. What's a bumper? Does anyone even know? I didn't know what a bumper was. So when she asked me what I wanted the bumper to sound like, I was like, I don't know. What's a bumper? Right? So a little more research would have been great for me. That's not really how I operate. I like to just dive in and figure it out as I go. But if you want to save money and headaches, figure out the things that you want, talk to some people that are already podcasting and ask them how they're achieving the results that they're getting. So if they already know a good Fiverr contractor, maybe they can just introduce you. But we found that some people on Fiverr are just completely unqualified. There's no tests. There's no, Fiverr doesn't ask them anything. You can just sign up. I could be an engineer on Fiverr, right? I could claim that I understand how to program different languages. You could hire me for a project and then I could just produce a Word document for you. And that's what the experience of Fiverr was like for us. And then the work that was still left to our team after engaging with these contractors, well, there was a ton of it. We had to coordinate everything between these contractors, cobble it all together. We had to collect collateral. We had to convert files. We had to upload things. We had to download things. There was just a huge series of things that we had to do to get to the point of completed podcasts. And I didn't want to do any of those things. What I wanted was a set it and forget it solution. And we never found one. So some of the issues using Fiverr, even if you find great contractors, is their availability, right? If they're backlogged for a month, you're not going to get your podcast done for a month. And the really good ones are very clear about their timelines. And if you are willing to pay a little bit more, sometimes you can jump to the front of the queue. Sometimes you can't. It really depends on the contractor. Having to supervise those less qualified Fiverr contractors to try and get us to a product that we liked at a price point that we wanted, that was way more work than I wanted to do. And then there was all these moving parts that required coordination weekly, right? Do we have the headshot? Do we have the headshot submitted to the Fiverr contractor who's going to make the audiogram? Do we have the audio clip cut from the editor on Fiverr that we then have to send to the person that's making the audiogram? We couldn't find one person on Fiverr that did everything. We had to find 5 people on Fiverr, and then we had to take all of their work and mash it together. It was not a great experience, but it's absolutely something that you could achieve. And if you're patient and you don't mind pushing buttons and trying things, Fiverr is a great, inexpensive way to get all kinds of things done for your business. So what's the business impact of the podcast been for us so far? Well, we're getting extra face time with the prospects that we're interested in doing business with. So there's plenty of vendors in the market that I haven't worked with yet. And a great first step to get introduced to them is to invite them to participate in this free podcast. It gives them exposure to our mailing list, right? We've got 10,000 MSPs on our mailing list. That's attractive to vendors. So if I haven't been able to get them to take a sales call from me, I have a far better chance of getting them to participate in a webinar where there is some marketing value to them. So I'm getting engaged with their marketing team, and then I can get championed into their sales development leadership. And ideally, that's the beginning of a great sales relationship for me. Same with MSPs that aren't taking my phone call. If I want to talk to a larger MSP who's not interested in my services, how can I engage with that person and begin a relationship? Well, I can invite them to collaborate on a podcast. Again, inviting those guests with better domain authority than mine and more context than mine means our name gets out in front of their prospects as well. So if somebody from PAX 8, for example, is on my podcast, they're promoting it to the PAX 8 audience. Well, PAX 8 has an extraordinary reach. So the odds on somebody from PAX 8's client base hearing my podcast and thinking that's interesting and then engaging with me, potentially very high. So I want to get interacting with the people that I want to buy my services eventually. And this is a low pressure, no sales way to do that. Begins a relationship. I get to interact with them at trade shows now, like, hey, how are you? And I get to share the results of and evaluate results of the podcast with them, talk about ways that we could have made it better. Now I've got 4 or 5 different touch points and a guaranteed pick up my phone call contact within a company that I want to get onto my roster. So if you think about how you can apply that in your business, you can do the exact same thing, right? If you've got the CEO of a law firm that you haven't been able to get on the phone, now you're going to invite them to participate in this business podcast. So the more times and ways that you can try to interact and collaborate with potential prospects, the more likely it is that you're going to win the opportunity to quote their business when it comes up. So it's a long-term strategy, but it's a strategy that works really well. So right now I get anywhere between 20 and 50 unique downloads of my podcast every week. So that's, 20 to 50 people that are spending an hour just listening to me talk. That doesn't happen very often. So for me, what I want to see happen next is I want to see those numbers go up, and I want to see people repeatedly listening. So right now I have a lot of one-time listeners. I want to be able to create a podcast that's a little bit stickier so that people listen to it over and over and over again, and it becomes more of a part of their week, right? When they're relying on the podcast that's going to be presented on Thursday afternoon, I want them to make it part of their weekly regimen. Oh, well, I listen to this podcast while I'm running. I want to be the podcast they listen to while they're running. So did you start a podcast? Well, pros, it can be cost effective. It's got high reach. There's a minimal initial spend. It's great thought leadership, and you can repurpose all the content elsewhere. Cons, well, when you do it wrong, it's expensive. There's a lot of opportunity cost involved. If you're going to do it yourself, it's probably going to be the most expensive marketing initiative you have. Setup and management is very labor intensive. And if it's not consistent, you lose your audience. So if you go 6 weeks in a row and then you drop the ball on it, you lose most of your audience who's relying on the content at that point. And then, of course, you've got the ongoing expenses and labor requirements. So while we did all this, we did this with the idea in mind that one of the things that we wanted to do for our clients was start developing better ways for them to engage with their prospects. So how can Managed Sales Pros help you if you're thinking about starting a podcast now? Well, we can do all those niggly things that we never wanted to do to begin with. We figured out how to do it. We figured out how to make it cost effective. We found the right people. We connected them to more right people, and we created a process and standard operating procedure that's allowing us to scale this. And we're super excited about it. You're hearing about it here first. We can produce your podcast for you. We can eliminate all of that legwork from you, manage it for you, and then we can combine it with other marketing strategies like phoning people to invite them to your podcast and then calling them afterwards to talk to them and invite them to chat with you further. So I'd love to talk to you about it. If it's something you're considering, you can reach us at hello@managedsalespros.com. That takes us right to the top of the hour. I didn't see any questions come in, but if you want to experience the podcast process before you start your own, I would love to invite you to be a guest on our podcast. So if you want to schedule a podcast with me, managedsalespros.com/booking takes you to our Microsoft booking page, and there is a specific entry there for a podcast guest. If you've got the time and the inclination, love to take you through it. No sales pitch, but I always need guests on the podcast. So thanks for joining today. If you have some questions, I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes, but I do see that we're 2 minutes over. So I want to give you back your time today. Thank you so much for attending, and I hope we'll see you again soon. Somebody asked if we're going to share the recording. Yeah, the recording will be posted on our YouTube page, and then it'll be embedded onto our website at managedsalespros.com/events. Oh, it's a pleasure. Well, doesn't look like we have any more questions today. So thanks very much again. And make sure you listen to Hallway Conference. You can find it anywhere where podcasts are published. I like to listen to it on Apple. Thanks, Dave. Always a pleasure to chat with you. Come be a podcast guest.